So I'm going to go ahead and start, and I'm going to leave the chat area open, and I'm going to start a PowerPoint presentation, which just helps outline what I'm talking about today about the gap year. So I'm Holly Bull, and I'm president of the Center for Interim Programs. Let me just share my screen here. Hang on just a sec here. Let's get this. So I may keep it in this format rather than doing the full PowerPoint. Can everybody, anybody, just chat really quickly. Can you see this PowerPoint and it's, okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so as I said, I'm Holly Bull, president of the Center for Interim Programs. I'm a gap year counselor. All I do is gap year counseling. And I've been doing this for 33 years. I've worked with over 2,000 or 3,000 students at this point. Interim started in 1980, and we work with over 8,000 students at this point across the US. So we're the oldest gap year counseling organization in the US, and we've worked obviously with many, many students and know many programs and options out there. So what I'm going to do today is just talk a little bit about my part in this process and the benefits of gap time and things to be concerned about or not, and the types of options that are out there, etc. So I'm speaking from a double bias, and here I am on my gap year at 17 in Hawaii in the fall of my gap year, doing aquaculture research. So my father started this company in 1980 when I was graduating from high school. So I had an in-house counselor to help me with my own plans before college. And it was great. I remember landing in Hawaii thinking, this is marvelous. I don't have homework. What a relief. And then had time to read and do my own homework in a sense. And during the day, I was scrubbing out shrimp tanks and chatting with scientists and was getting a pretty good sense of the daily do of that kind of work. And after, I don't know, 2 months or so, I thought, I don't probably have the patience for this kind of research. This is not something I probably want to pursue as a major in college or as work in the world. Really helpful to know before heading to college and stepping into that field potentially. This picture is actually from a University of Hawaii research expedition that I got on board. And we were studying phosphorescence in deep water creatures. And we ended up inadvertently pulling up this 7 or 8 foot dying female squid, which was really exciting. I mean, this is not something people normally see. And I love this image just because it gives you the visceral hit of hands-on learning. You're not reading about it in a book. You're not watching a YouTube video. No, you're on the deck of a boat in the sun, and you're seeing this creature come up from the depths. I mean, that's really exciting. Not for everybody, but certainly was for me. And then the second part of my gap year, I went off to Hawaii and did work with a group of peers studying modern Greek language, history, poetry, literature. So part of my year was volunteer, not with peers, with older adults. Part of my year was with a group of students. And Greece was great because everything I was studying was directly related to the culture around me, right under my nose. And I got excited about learning again for its own sake after that experience in Greece. Then I went to college for 2 years, and I took another gap year after my sophomore year in college. Went to India, Nepal, back to Greece, did service work in Appalachia. And all this to say I'm really biased in favor of taking gap time if you want to. I mean, this is really key. So for me as a counselor, the core of taking gap time is all about choosing. It's when we're in school and we're put in school often or expected to go to college, there's not a lot of, ooh, I choose. There's a lot of I have to, I ought to, I should. And with gap time, ideally you're asking the question, who am I? What am I doing on this planet? What interests me? And then I choose and own what I'm up to. And you're starting to lead from this core pivot outward, whoever that is. Only you know who that is if you're a student. So it gives you this year to just go and explore and go toward things that draw you. You're going to learn from everything. There's no perfect way to do this. There's just you really going toward what draws you and the process. And that's just practicing that for a year is a skill, choosing and owning your life. That's the beginning of personal power. So what is a gap year? It's really this chance to explore interests and skills, typically between high school and college or during college. Usually it's around 3 to 9 months, very much a year on. People say I'm taking a year off, baloney. You're totally on. You have to be on because you're stepping into things that are different from the familiar. And really it's for anyone. Hold on just a second, let me pull down here. Yeah, it's really for anyone, and people with taking time with intentionality. So it's not just, oh, I'm just going to go, wander off in a gap year. And you really are thinking, how do I follow up on some interests that I have? Let me go gain experience. You don't have to have experience to do it, and it really is for all different types of learning styles and all ages. We actually work with all ages, but mostly it's students between high school and college, and then the next wave are step-aways, as I call them, people who take a break from college. Many benefits to this kind of time. You're already more self-motivated when you're going towards something you're drawn to. And you have a chance to just rest and offload stress. You're not being graded typically. There's no in order to here. There's just the freedom to explore. For me, there was a big deal about getting some relevance of the studies to the world. All this stuff I've been cramming into my head in school. How does it relate to the world around me? And for many students, they're starting to think about budgeting more because they have to, and they're more aware of what things cost. We had a very funny story I was on a gap year panel with a single mom whose son was doing city year, and she said the best phone call she ever got from him was, "Hey mom, do you realize how much groceries cost?" She's like, "Uh-huh." So, he was focused on it and thinking about it. And parents can help with that by just saying, hey, here's what we can comfortably or willing to put toward your gap time, and then the student's learning how to budget. Everything you do in a gap year goes on a resume. So you're building a resume before you even hit college. These are skills you're going to probably use in the work world and beyond, way more than most classroom skills or classroom learning in terms of what you draw on later on. And if you get a better sense of what you want to focus on or not, you're going to save a lot of time in college, changing majors, changing schools. That's why it takes people an average of 5 or 6 years to finish college, because often they're really not sure what they're doing there. And having that clarity about what you might want to do, post-college if you're going to college. And by the way, not everyone has to go to college. You might say, no, not interested in college. I want to go get training, in the recording arts. And these types of programs can also give you skills that will lead to work. I would say most students are looking at college beyond, so they're applying to college and deferring, and then they're stepping into this time. I had a young woman who was thinking about being a surgeon, excuse me, and she spent 4 weeks just at the shoulders of surgeons in Asia on a program specifically for pre-med students. And here she is at 18, excuse me, coming home and saying to her parents, I don't think I'm going to be a surgeon. I will be a surgeon. So for her, it really gave her that clarity, which you want if you're looking at med school down the line. And then just how you transition from college into the work world is easier after gap time, because you've had this half step out into the work world already, in a sense, or it's sort of like a trial run. And that can really help people not feel so daunted by stepping into that later on. So how do gap year students perform in college? So here's the myth, that students are going to lose academic momentum if they step away from formal studies. And the reality is, on average, these students are performing at higher levels than non-gap year students. It's also very rare. Sometimes people worry that if you take a gap year, you're not going to continue on to college if you're thinking about college. And it is very rare that people get derailed by a gap year. In fact, they're usually far more fired up about stepping into college after gap time. I certainly was. So here's some of the data. Bob Claggett, who was in Harvard admissions for years, then Dean of Admission at Middlebury College, started to track the GPAs of gap year students. And the dark blue are the gap year students' GPAs. And what he saw is that these students, there were several percentage points higher than their peers. Most of these students hadn't done anything academic for a full year, and they were still outperforming how they were expected to do and outperforming a lot of their peers. So you might be a little rusty, you're not going to forget how to learn. And usually you're much more fired up. Then Bob ran the numbers for UNC Chapel Hill, and you can see the results even more dramatic. The light blue are the GPAs of the gap year students. This is like 2011 to 2014. It's not a huge pool of students, but it is statistically significant that these gap year students are doing better in college. Why? Because they're more motivated, they're more rested, they have a sense of that relevance, they know why they're in school. Just the level of maturity is different. All these things can pull together, I think, to make a much more engaged student. This is Colorado College's Dean of Admission, Mark Hatch. I've been on lots of gap year panels with these folks. Mark was also in Harvard admissions before he went to Colorado College. The same thing here, saying the first year GPAs are higher at CC, and this is unusual. Gap year males, he said, are outperforming non-gap year female peers. That's statistically weird, and they're way outperforming non-gap year male peers. So again, this year of maturity is making a big difference for young men. He said these students are leaders on campus. They don't have the behavioral issues and dramas. They're not coming out of high school and home, and they tend to finish college in 4 years or fewer. So they're really efficient students. He said, we want to see 20% of our incoming freshman class have taken the gap year. Colorado College has also become a research hub for gap year, and they're looking at things like the mental health of gap year students before and after gap year. And what they're seeing is anxiety levels are going down, depression levels are going down. These are all things that anecdotally I can tell you from in my 33 years of counseling students, that just students are happier. He also noticed a lower number of disciplinary incidents in college, especially in young men. And I mentioned that there's a savings here when students take more time to go through college. If the average is 5 or 6 years, and gap year students tend to finish in 4 or fewer years, you can start to see the savings. You know, if you're in an out-of-state, public college out-of-state, you know, you might be saving close to $75,000 if it's between 4 and 6 years. Or the private college even more, you know, $97,000. Or even if it's 1 extra year, it's going to be a significant amount of money in tuition that you're not spending. And gap years themselves don't cost as much as college. You don't have to spend. You could do nothing but room and board type programs and get the benefits, the same benefits, and spend very little on a gap year itself. Okay, sorry. Potential pitfalls and challenges. Okay, so ideally you don't want to force a gap year on someone. I had parents will drag their child into my office, and usually I'll tell the student, you know, this only works if you want to do it. For me, it's all about choosing. And I'll say, maybe you hadn't thought about this. Are you willing to have the conversation? Because I think often people don't realize what they can do with this kind of a year, or, you know, or what it is. And then often they'll turn toward it. But if they're really not interested, it's usually better not to force it on them. And you want to make sure you're landing in well-run programs, so you're not landing in a dud placement or an unsafe option. And you need to put some thought into the year itself, because if you're doing more than one thing during the whole year, it's going to have a number of different moving parts to it. And so you don't want too many gaps during your gap year. It does take work. Students are changing, plans are changing, which is totally normal. And also, I think people are looking, well, how do we afford this on top of college costs? But like I said, you don't have to spend a lot on a gap year. And this is part of your education, you know, to my mind. This is not a break from education. This could be some of the most important time you take in your life in terms of, you know, pivoting you towards something you love or away from something you don't. And then you're also still garnering all these different skills, no matter what. Okay, so here's what's out there. So when I say program, I call everything program. And, oops, sorry. The first category are the facilitated group programs. So this year with COVID, these are the programs that are really running. And students are in Hawaii, they're in the mainland US. We have over 160 students on hands-on programs this fall. Even with COVID, they're out in small groups, on site, doing hands-on experiences. And also in Ireland, and also in Israel, and also in England, even in Italy, through specific programs where they're able to quarantine and then step in and engage. So typically, a lot of these group programs are running internationally. Many of them obviously couldn't run internationally, so they created the domestic programs. And it could be sort of cultural study and outdoor adventure combined. Some of them focus more on marine-related things. Some of them are focused on just the outdoor skills, like the hiking, backpacking, or art history, or studio art, or language immersion. These guarantee you a peer group. So many students like to start with these in the fall for a couple of months and get the most structure and support for that first step out into a gap year. And you're paying some overarching fee or tuition for these. And then the next category are skill-based intensives. So these are shorter, 1 to 4 weeks, where you're paying a fee for them, but they're less than the group programs. The group programs can run, I don't know, 14, 16,000 a semester at this point, depending on the program. These are less expensive. These are going to be with a range of ages, but often teens and 20s. And you're getting some kind of certification or at least a lot of information in a very short period of time. So it could be a cooking intensive. It could be a writing course, learn how to run a film, doing filmmaking or run a recording studio. Or you could be learning how to teach skiing or snowboarding or yoga or getting your wilderness EMT. This is the middle picture there. Learn how to build a guitar, scuba certifications, wilderness survival skills. This is actually a course I did just to see what it was like. It was a week-long wilderness survival skill course. And again, these can be tucked into gap time, so they're really short. You get a lot of information, and they're very flexible. This fall, I had a young woman do the wilderness EMT. Again, even with COVID, she was able to do an on-site training program. Next category are the internships. So these are a very specific category, harder to set these up for gappers, and they tend to run 2 to 3 months or 6 to 12 weeks. Sorry, and you're dropping into a city, could be Dublin, could be Barcelona, it could be in South Africa, Cape Town, New Zealand, Australia, could be in Argentina, depending, and a couple in the States. And you're not with there are a couple that are like a hybrid of a group gap year program combined with internship, and those can be in the US or in Israel. But then a number of these are more individual placements, but you're living in shared apartments with fellow interns. So you have a built-in social life, which is key for a lot of students. And you're living in an apartment, you have to cook for yourself, clean up after yourself ideally, head out the door every day to a job like placement. You pay for these, but they're well worth it for what you're getting because you are stepping into a more substantive work experience. So I had a young man do computer marketing in Barcelona. My stepdaughter did a gap year and she worked for a little startup company in Dublin, Ireland. She said, I'm pretty sure it helped me get my job with IBM post-college because that's all we talked about during the interview. So this is a great half step into a work environment and to check out if a particular field appeals to you or not. So we've had people do teaching type placements, work with a human rights lawyer in Africa, refugee centers, quite a range here. And then the last category is much more low cost. So the first 3 are set up for you, you're paying something for them. The last category are all the volunteer or work placements where you might get housing and food in exchange for labor. So you could be coaching kids in sports, helping on board a tall ship, teaching kids, working with animals, domestic or wild, conservation projects, disaster relief work. We have a young woman this fall who was just clearing trails in national parks in California. They kept having to move the group because of the fires. So they kept moving south, but they were still part of a group and doing hands-on work and very low cost. She got the housing and the food in exchange for just clearing trails and moving rocks and using chainsaws and so forth. So a number of students will weave these into their gap time, and it drops the cost of a gap year down. These are all different lengths of time all over the world, all different ages, a lot of flexibility. There's another category that we've created this year because of COVID. We had all these students who had to come back early this past March, and we just started collecting online everything, online internships, work, skill-based intensives, volunteer placements, classes of all kinds. Most people are just really doing this. They don't even want to think about anything online. So these are backup options. And some students have used them as filler. And so I have a couple of students who are doing online programs this fall, but most students really wanted to do the hands-on. Here's a sample year. So say you're a senior and you're looking at the coming year. Typically in the summers, people work. They do their own, local job, see friends. Sometimes people do programs in the summer, but generally not. So when everybody heads off to school or whatever they're doing, ideally you step into something for the fall that will fill the fall. And typically these are more the facilitated group program, most structure and support. If you want that, not that you have to do that. This is, again, just a sample. And then home, take a break. Sometimes students are reapplying to colleges, if they want to or need to, halfway through the gap year, but most people have applied and deferred, typically. And then January through May, invariably students want to step into more independent placements in the winter to spring. And this is where the internships or the skill-based intensives or volunteer work all start to come into play. And you see this progression from the most structure and support to more independent placements right through until college. So the common questions and concerns I hear from students: I don't want to get behind my high school class, or am I going to be too old as a college freshman if I take a gap year? Which I have an 18-year-old daughter right now, and that's her concern. I don't want to be too old when I land in college. I'm going to be maybe 20. And what she doesn't know is that you're not so age-bound in college. It doesn't matter that much. There are lots of gappers now in college. So even though people have these concerns, they don't play out the way they think. I've never had anybody say, Holly, I wish I hadn't done a gap year because I felt too old as a freshman. No, you are going to be more mature. There's no question about it. And some people feel like that's a benefit. You know, they're like the go-to person in their dorm. For students feeling like they're going to get behind, really when you leave high school, everyone's on a parallel track and everyone's dispersing to different schools often. And you could be stepping into a program in the fall with gap year peers. So you're with people who'd normally be in college with you. So you're not so out of sync. And the reality is you're so far ahead of the game in terms of what you're learning and are able to use, and it's resume building down the line. And again, people don't realize that, but there's so many people who are graduating with a major who don't have a clue as to who they are or what they want to get at. And gap year students generally have a lot more awareness, which really helps. For parents, obviously safety and budgeting, these are the concerns they're looking at. You want to do your due diligence. At the very end, I have a slide with some resources on programs or organizations that are vetting programs, aside from the gap year counselors that are out there. Typically, as I said, people are applying and deferring college, but you can reapply to some of these schools. Most colleges will give you a deferral. Some of the state schools in, say, California will not, so you may have to reapply. And then the application deadlines for gap year programs are much later. So seniors right now are just focusing on college apps often, and then they'll start working on their gap year plans in the spring, even into summer. If you're on a tight budget, ask group programs for scholarships. There's scholarships out there. If you have a 529 plan and you want to use it, some of the programs, the group programs, are accredited, so you might be able to use that 529 money for that program. You might not be able to get the credit, though, because most colleges, I've found, will say, fine, take a gap year, but don't garner credit or too much credit because we want you to come in as a freshman. All right, now, this is just a humorous photo or image that I like to use because it's so much part of our, our Western lives. In a sense, we're very linear and goal-oriented, and this is our academic plan and our gap year plan and our life plan. And the reality of our lives is this, it's the ups and the downs, and here's COVID, and it's just like dealing with all these different experiences in your life, which actually give you the richness of your life experience. And the more time that you can take earlier on in your life to explore when you're not tied to much, the better. This is not goof off time. I took 2 gap years, before and during college, and I am so glad I did because I know later I wouldn't have been able to do that as easily. And I draw on those experiences all the time. And it's not just because I do this work. And they've given me a wider frame of reference and connecting points with people and a skill set I wouldn't have. So there's just tremendous value, and there's no rush in getting through your life here. Everyone feels like faster is always better. And it's basically baloney. All right, some helpful resources for you all. The Gap Year Association is vetting programs and collecting information on all things sort of American gap year. There are gap year fairs that take place every year, and these are now run by Go Overseas, and they're going to be virtual this year. It's sort of like a college fair, and those are going to be starting up in December and January, February, and March. The Year Out Group is a British organization, kind of like the Gap Year Association, and they're vetting British programs. So if you're wanting to do your due diligence on programs, you can look at these. Just be aware that a lot of these programs, not all the programs are going to show up. You're going to get more of the group programs, but like a chocolate farm in Costa Rica is not going to show up in those listings probably. So there's it's like the tip of the iceberg in terms of other things that are out there. They're pretty interesting and often more unusual and low cost that won't show up in these vetting organizations. And then there are a number of us gap year advisors. As I said, I'm Holly Bull, and I run the Center for Interim Programs, interimprograms.com here in Princeton, New Jersey, and we work with students across the U.S. Most of us gap year advisors do a free brainstorming session just to see, who are these people? What do they have to offer? What could I do specifically? We don't necessarily give you program info, names, and so forth, but we are usually providing enough to give you a sense of, wow, based on my interests, here's what a year could look like. And then you can make a decision about taking a gap year with more information under your belt, and you can decide if you need someone's help or not, like a counselor, but there's no obligation. Okay, I think I have a bit of time here. Let me just check if there are any questions. So Jonah Shin said, how much did it cost for me? And how much less expensive was it compared to a year in college? My gap year when I did it was, well, I worked both summers to help pay for all the airfare during my year. So, and then I did one program that was volunteer, and my parents chipped in for housing, or rather just food costs, I think, because I was staying with family friends whom I didn't know before I went to Hawaii. So that was really inexpensive because I covered round trip Hawaii, round trip Greece, and then my parents had to pay for some food and a program in Greece that cost about $3,000 at the time. It was way less expensive, for me to be on that gap year for them, with my two older brothers in college at the same time. So it gave them a real breather. I had a young man who did nothing but room and board placements during his whole gap year. He paid for the whole year himself, and we gave him scholarship for our fee. So it really, you don't have to bleed financially to have a great gap year. Okay, anybody else has any questions here? Please feel free to put them in. Coming in late, but where do we look for the options of programs? We don't have, oops, wait a minute. I have here that, do you see the helpful resources there? This can get you going on program options. I'm a gap year counselor, so I don't just tell people all the programs out there, because that's the value of what we're offering, because we're vetting programs, and we've been doing this for years. So we can describe types of options, but we don't give you names of programs. But these are some resources where you can begin to look at types of programs, actual programs. Go overseas, list hundreds and hundreds of programs. You just do your due diligence. You want to make sure you look at them carefully, talk to people who've attended the program if you can. That's a really good way to do your due diligence. Yeah, you're more than welcome. Okay, anybody else have any questions? I have a minute or so here. You can also reach me in Princeton here. Later on, interimprograms.com or hollybull@interimprograms.com. If you have further questions, I'm happy to answer them.